to go further than you ever have imagined, to face overwhelming fears, and to continue to fight on. These are themes that you often find in many inspirational movies and TV series. And this is the theme that I find is overwhelmingly strong in the 8th episode of Girls' Last Tour. However, unlike many of these inspirational movies that often give you a feel-good with the episode, Episode 8 of Girls' Last Tour, from my perspective, was the saddest and the most depressing of all of the 8 episodes so far. So what's up, people, and welcome to the 8th episode discussion of Girls' Last Tour. And as mentioned, the theme that I found from this episode was the fight to continue to move on, despite all the overwhelming odds that come after you. And yes, I do feel that this episode was the most depressing and darkest of all the 8 episodes so far. Because despite all of the efforts that these girls do to continue to move forward, I felt that the overwhelming odds stacked against them continued to rise. And so, despite the fight and despite the inspiring tenacity that these girls provide, you start getting a feeling of dread that no matter how much they fight, the world around them will not be a forgiving environment, and it will get harder and harder to move forward. Now, episode 8 is broken down into 2 particular parts. The first part is where the girls find themselves in this unusual array of stacked obelisk-type structures. And they find containers in all of these structures, a locker type of container. And most of them are shut, but every once in a while they find one that's slightly open. And they notice that there's some weird, trivial trinkets inside each one of these. One of them contained a broken radio, another one contained a piece of cloth, and another one contained a button. And they couldn't figure out what it was initially. But eventually, Chi realizes that this is a graveyard, and those are the caskets of the long deceased. And probably the items that they had taken out of the open drawers were keepsakes of people who had passed away. And because of that, they decide to put them back. Now, it's a relatively simplistic story as far as plot goes, but the overwhelming message is more in terms of feeling. There is a sense of dread that comes out because they are surrounded by so much death. And it does give a feeling that they are getting closer and closer to some sort of demise. It also gives some message with regards to what happened to the world, that the world is literally wiped out and humanity has gone away. And so this graveyard and the symbolism that comes from it gives an overwhelming dark feeling to this particular episode. However, what made me really depressed was not this episode, but the one after, where the 2 girls on their journey find a spiral ramp that takes them to the next level up. And during that traverse, the 2 girls have another philosophical discussion. Basically, the going around in the circle in this tower represents their daily existence. They're getting up, moving forward, going back to sleep, getting up, moving forward, going back to sleep. That cycle that never ends. And the thing that Chi is starting to say, which is the most depressing part of this story, is despite them moving forward and there is this hope that they can move forward to eventually get better, nothing seems to be getting better. In fact, things seem to be getting more difficult. It gets harder to move forward to the next section. They're having more difficulty finding food. And so, with regards to Chi, the despair that comes through this life, the daily existence in this world, is somewhat represented by the spiral traverse that they're going through. And eventually they get to a point where the ramp is completely broken and there's a makeshift ramp that's outside this tower that they have to go through. And since they are going with the Kettenkrad, which is a very heavy vehicle, and the outside ramp was designed to only carry humans that were walking, they are not sure whether they can get through or not. And it's at this point that we see the other side, the you side, right? Where she's saying, yes, it might be getting darker, things might be getting more difficult, but she will not give up in moving forward. And thus, regardless of how dangerous it is, they have to go forward because there's no other choice that they can make. And so they decide to go forward. She with a very skeptical side to her actions, and you with a very courageous, let's move on sort of feeling. And it is important that you has that feeling because right in the middle of their traverse, things start going bad and the ramp starts breaking down. And the only thing that saves them from getting through is it is you who is calm and collected and takes action and grabs the handlebars and accelerates the Kettenkrad enough to keep them ahead of the broken ramp and gets them through to the very end. And so they survive, and Yu is very happy, Chi is relieved, but it does represent a more difficult situation as they go along. Every single episode seems to be getting harder for them to keep on going. And so Chi's concern comes up. Regardless of how courageous Yu is in moving forward, just how far can they actually go? But Yu's side is also important in the sense that if that is the only road that they have, what are you going to do except to move forward? And if you're going to move forward, why don't you move forward with the best determination that you have? You will be the best person to have if you are depressed, and Chi is there to keep you in line in case she goes overboard. So they actually do make a great pair despite how polar opposite their personality is. And the final part is after they pass through the tower and they're looking around in the new area that they get to, they find that it's completely desolate. There is nothing there. There's a few empty buildings and they don't find any food and they're not sure, why they even got there because there's nothing really to greet them when they got there except a couple of bottles of beer, which they're not sure what it is, but they figure if it's some sort of beverage, they might as well drink it. And so the final part of this episode is actually quite lighthearted because they actually get influenced by the alcohol and the two of them end up having a wonderful time during that evening. And so it's a very interesting episode in that it ends with a lightheartedness. They do find that moment of enjoyment within all of this despair. But the thing that made me feel that this was the most negative episode of all of them was that in the previous ones, maybe it's ignorance is bliss, but there was always this feeling that maybe if they kept on going, they would eventually find something good. And the efforts that they've done is worthwhile. The thing that I find with this one is even with that drunken stupor bliss, it feels almost made up. Something that they'll just have as a short enjoyment, and they will have to go back to that very difficult journey that they will go through in the future. We don't know yet, but it gave a much more negative message compared to the others. The hope that we were seeing in the previous ones is kind of being overshadowed by the dread that you worry about with regards to these two girls' future. So this is an episode where it actually had a very special ending. The ending was of those two girls dancing. Usually these episodes ends with the closing song, which is always the same. But for this episode, it ended with the two girls dancing during the time they were drunk. and having a happy time. But as lighthearted as the song was, there was a tinge of sadness in that entire closing, in a sense that it almost felt like a calm before a storm, and it almost felt like they were having to force themselves to get drunk to obtain that happiness, right? That everything around them was falling apart. I hope that's not the case, and I hope that it does get to a better point. But this is a post-apocalyptic series, and so there is some possibility that we will have to brace ourselves for whatever may come up next. But in any case, that was my interpretation of episode 8 of Girls' Last Tour. And it will be interesting to see what happens in the final 4 episodes. Will we be getting some sort of closure that is bright and hopeful? Or will we be getting something that is much more darker? It will be interesting to find out what happens. But I will continue to load up these videos as I watch the future episodes. And I hope you join me at that time. And until the next episode, happy adventuring, and as always, Jaya, everyone.